I'm Cassandra Vale, 28 years old, and I'm crouched behind my kitchen island with a split lip and bruised ribs, watching my own mother swing a ceramic vase at my head while my father screams about the $500,000 inheritance I refuse to hand over. What they don't know is that I have my lawyer on speakerphone, recording every threat, every violent outburst, every word that's about to destroy their lives forever. The same parents who abandoned me in foster care when I was 12 are now beating me in my own home, demanding money from the grandmother they forbade me from seeing, the grandmother who loved me enough to leave me everything they thought they deserved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony isn't lost on me. 3 hours ago, they showed up at my doorstep with fake tears and rehearsed apologies, claiming they wanted to rebuild our relationship. Now my mother's perfectly manicured nails are digging into my arm as she shrieks about how ungrateful I am, how I owe them for bringing me into this world. My father, the man who told a social worker I was too much trouble, 16 years ago, is now explaining in graphic detail what he'll do to me if I don't transfer the money by midnight tonight. But here's what Victor and Marina Vale don't understand about the daughter they threw away. I learned to survive without them. I learned to thrive without them. And most importantly, I learned to fight back. Are you getting all this, David? I whisper into my phone, blood trickling from my nose onto the screen. Every word, Cassie. My lawyer's voice crackles through the speaker. Keep them talking. The police are already on their way. Before I tell you exactly how this night ends, and trust me, the ending will shock you even more than how it started, I need you to understand something. Drop a comment letting me know, have you ever had someone try to take credit for your success after they abandoned you when you needed them most? Hit like if you've ever had to protect yourself from the very people who were supposed to protect you. Because what happened in my kitchen that night wasn't just about money, it was about 15 years of rage, survival, and a little girl who grew up to become someone her parents never saw coming. You see, the $500,000 wasn't just an inheritance. It was validation. It was proof that someone had loved me unconditionally, when my own parents couldn't be bothered to visit me on weekends. It was my deceased grandmother, Elena's final gift. Not just the money, but the message that came with it. You were always worthy of love, even when they couldn't see it. But Victor and Marina Vale saw dollar signs. They saw a payday for 16 years of child support they never paid, birthday presents they never gave, Christmas mornings they spent without me. They saw compensation for the emotional trauma of giving up their rights to a troubled kid who was cramping their lifestyle. What they didn't see was security cameras. What they didn't see was the restraining order I'd already prepared. What they didn't see was 15 years of survival skills that would make their intimidation tactics look like child's play. As my mother raises that vase again, her eyes wild with desperation and greed, I realize this moment has been inevitable since the day they signed those papers, the day they chose freedom over responsibility, the day they chose themselves over their own child. You think you're so smart, my father snarls, grabbing my wrist and twisting until I cry out. Living in this fancy house, acting like you're better than us, that money should be ours. We're her real family. Where were you when I aged out of foster care? I managed through gritted teeth. Where were you when I was sleeping in my car? Where were you when I was working 3 jobs to put myself through college? My mother laughs, a sound like breaking glass. That's ancient history, Cassandra. We're here now, we want to make things right. By beating me unconscious in my own kitchen, by taking what's rightfully ours, my father corrects, his grip tightening. You ungrateful little. That's when I hear the siren. That's when I see the fear creep into their eyes for the first time tonight. That's when they realize they've made a mistake that will cost them everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to this moment, how 2 people could abandon their child and then show up 16 years later demanding a fortune, you need to know the whole story. You need to understand what it's like to grow up unwanted, to build a life from nothing, to discover that the person who saved you was the same person your parents forbade you from knowing. You need to know about Elena Vale, the grandmother who defied her own son to love me in secret, about the letters she wrote that I never received, the birthday cards my parents threw away, the inheritance that was meant to be my college fund, the college fund my parents spent on a vacation to Maui, while I was learning to change my own diapers in a foster home in Millbrook. You need to know about the investigation that led to this inheritance, the private detective who uncovered 15 years of lies, and the letter Elena left me that didn't just change my bank account, it changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Most importantly, you need to know what happened when those sirens got closer, when my parents realized their get-rich-quick scheme had turned into a felony assault charge, and when I finally got to say the words I'd been rehearsing for 16 years. But first, let me take you back to where it all began, back to Millbrook, where a 12-year-old girl learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you most are the ones who will hurt you deepest. Back to the day my parents decided I was too expensive, too difficult, too much work, and made a choice that would define all our lives forever. Because this story isn't just about money, inheritance, or even revenge. It's about what happens when someone you threw away refuses to stay gone. It's about the difference between the family you're born into and the family you choose. And it's about the moment when the powerless become powerful, when the abandoned become unstoppable, and when justice finally catches up to people who thought they were untouchable. So buckle up, because this ride is just getting started. And trust me, the ending is worth every twist along the way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Growing up as Cassandra Vale, in the affluent suburb of Millbrook, meant living in a world where appearances mattered more than reality, where image was everything, and children were accessories to be displayed when convenient. My parents, Victor and Marina, had crafted their lives like a carefully curated social media feed, every detail designed to project success, sophistication, and the perfect American dream. Victor Vale owned 3 luxury car dealerships across Millbrook County, specializing in European imports that cost more than most people's houses. He was the kind of man who wore $1,000 suits to Little League games and handed out business cards at church potluck. Success wasn't just his profession, it was his identity. Every conversation somehow circled back to his latest sale, his expanding empire, his vision for dominating the luxury automotive market in our region. Marina, my mother, came from old Millbrook money, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. Her family, the Thorntons, had owned half the commercial real estate in downtown Millbrook for 3 generations. She'd grown up in the sprawling Thornton estate on Maple Ridge, attended exclusive private schools, and married Victor not for love, but because he represented the new money that could complement her family's established fortune. They attended every charity gala, sat on the boards of prestigious organizations, and threw parties that were featured in the Millbrook Lifestyle magazine. Their marriage was a business merger disguised as a romance, and for the first 12 years of my life I was simply another asset in their carefully managed portfolio. Our house on Elmwood Avenue was a testament to their success, a massive colonial revival, with manicured gardens, a circular driveway, and enough bedrooms to house a small army. Every room was professionally decorated, every surface polished to perfection. It was the kind of house where children were expected to be seen and not heard, where spilling juice on the Persian rugs was a capital offense, and where spontaneous laughter was discouraged as unseemly. The Vale family had rules, unspoken but absolute. Success was measured in dollars and social standing. Emotions were private matters, never to be displayed publicly. Children should be accomplished, well-behaved, and most importantly, easy to manage. We attended the right schools, participated in the right activities, and associated with the right families. My older brother Marcus was the golden child, captain of the lacrosse team, honor roll student, early admission to Millbrook Preparatory Academy. He embodied everything my parents valued: competitive, charming, and completely focused on maintaining the family image. Marcus never questioned the rules because following them came naturally to him. He was Victor's mini-me in training, already showing interest in the car business and dating the daughter of Millbrook's mayor. My younger sister Isabella was the princess, beautiful, compliant, and content to let others make decisions for her. At 10 years old, she was already enrolled in etiquette classes, piano lessons, and French tutoring. Isabella had inherited Marina's delicate features and quiet demeanor, making her the perfect daughter to display at social functions. She spoke when spoken to, smiled on command, and never caused trouble. Then there was me. I was the anomaly in the Vale family equation. While Marcus dominated on the lacrosse field, I preferred reading in quiet corners. While Isabella charmed adults with her perfect manners, I asked uncomfortable questions about why some families in Millbrook lived in mansions while others couldn't afford groceries. I was curious about people my parents considered beneath us, fascinated by stories from the wrong side of town, and completely uninterested in the social climbing that consumed our household. Cassandra has such an active imagination, Marina would say with a tight smile when other parents mentioned my tendency to befriend the scholarship kids at school. We're working on channeling that energy more appropriate. The truth was, I didn't fit their mold, and in the Vale family, not fitting the mold was the ultimate failure. While my siblings thrived in the competitive, appearance-focused environment our parents had created, I felt like I was suffocating. Every family dinner was a performance review, every social event a test I couldn't seem to pass. The hierarchy in our house was clear. Victor ruled with quiet authority. Marina managed the details with military precision. Marcus was the heir apparent. Isabella was the prized possession, and I was the problem to be solved. My parents' love felt conditional, based on achievements and behavior rather than simply existing. Good grades earned approval. Perfect behavior at social events earned privileges. Questioning the family way of doing things earned lectures about gratitude and conformity. It wasn't cruelty in the traditional sense. It was the systematic molding of children into predetermined shapes. But there was one person in my life who saw me differently, who loved me without conditions or expectation. My grandmother Elena, Victor's mother, lived in a modest house on the other side of Millbrook, a world away from our Elmwood Avenue mansion, despite being only 20 minutes by car. Elena Vale was everything my parents weren't: warm, spontaneous, and completely unimpressed by material wealth. She had raised Victor during much harder times when the family struggled to make ends meet. But as Victor's success grew, so did the distance between them. Elena represented a past my father wanted to forget, a reminder of humble beginnings that didn't fit his current image. "Your grandmother fills your head with nonsense," Marina would say whenever I returned from Elena's house with stories about her neighbors, her garden, or her volunteer work at the community center. "She doesn't understand the world we live in now." Family gatherings were exercises in tension management. Elena would arrive with homemade gifts and stories about her simple life, while my parents tried to steer conversations toward more appropriate topics: Marcus's academic achievements, Isabella's upcoming recital, or the latest expansion of Victor's business empire. I was the bridge between these two worlds, equally uncomfortable in both, but drawn to the warmth and authenticity I found at Elena's house. While my parents measured worth in accomplishments and appearances, Elena measured it in kindness and character. While my siblings learned to see people as networking opportunities or status symbols, Elena taught me to see people as individuals with their own stories and struggles. The Vale family system worked perfectly for everyone, except me. It provided structure, success, and social standing for those who could play by its rules. But for a child who questioned those rules, who felt more comfortable with authentic connections than strategic relationships, who valued kindness over achievement, it was a beautiful prison. What I didn't know then was that my discomfort with the family system would soon become irrelevant. What I didn't know was that Victor and Marina were about to face a financial crisis that would change everything. And what I didn't know was that my parents had already decided that if sacrifices had to be made to maintain their lifestyle and image, I would be the sacrifice they were willing to make. The perfect Vale family portrait was about to crack, and I was about to discover just how conditional their love really was. While my parents orchestrated their perfect social performances and my siblings excelled at being everything the Vale family required, I found refuge in the most unlikely place: Elena's small house on Birchwood Street, where the real world existed behind closed doors. Every other Saturday I would walk the 23 blocks from our mansion to Elena's neighborhood, crossing invisible boundaries that separated Millbrook's elite from its working-class residents. My parents tolerated these visits with barely concealed irritation, viewing them as a necessary obligation rather than meaningful family time. "Just don't come back with any of her old-fashioned ideas," Marina would warn as I headed out the door. But Elena's house was where I discovered who I really was beneath the layers of Vale family expectations. Her living room smelled like cinnamon and vanilla, not the sterile perfection of professionally maintained air purifier. Her walls were covered with photographs spanning decades, real family moments, not the staged portraits that adorned our formal dining room. Most importantly, Elena listened to me talk about things that mattered to me, things my parents dismissed as childish or inappropriate. Elena had been a social worker for 37 years before retiring, and her stories fascinated me in ways that Marcus's lacrosse victories and Isabella's piano recitals never could. She told me about families she'd helped reunite, children she'd placed in loving homes, and the complicated realities of people whose lives didn't fit neat categories. While my parents taught me to see the world in terms of success and failure, Elena showed me a universe of human complexity that was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "You have your great-grandmother's heart," Elena would tell me, showing me sepia photographs of a woman named Rose, who had worked as a nurse during the Great Depression. "She saw people others overlooked, just like you did." These conversations happened in whispers, away from my parents' ears, because Elena understood that my curiosity about social justice and helping others was not something the Vale family encouraged. What I didn't realize during those Saturday visits was that Elena was keeping secrets, big ones. Hidden in her bedroom closet was a box labeled "For Cassandra" that contained 15 years of documentation about our family's real financial situation, Victor's business practices, and most shocking of all, evidence that my parents had been systematically lying about their relationship with her. Elena had been secretly investigating my father's business dealings for years, concerned about rumors she'd heard from her former colleagues in social services. Victor's luxury car dealerships, she discovered, were built on a foundation of predatory lending practices targeting vulnerable customers. He specialized in selling overpriced vehicles to people who couldn't afford them, using high-pressure tactics and hidden fees that trapped buyers in cycles of debt they couldn't escape. While Victor presented himself as a successful businessman serving affluent customers, the reality was that 60% of his profits came from exploiting families desperate for reliable transportation. Elena had documented cases where single mothers lost their cars and fell deeper into poverty because of Victor's deliberately confusing financing scheme. She'd found evidence of forged documents, manipulated credit reports, and partnerships with unscrupulous lending companies that charged interest rates bordering on criminal. But Elena's investigation went deeper than business ethics. She'd uncovered the truth about the Thornton family money that Marina claimed as her inheritance. The Thornton real estate empire, it turned out, was crumbling. Marina's father had made a series of disastrous investments in the early 2000s, and the family had been quietly selling properties to maintain their lifestyle. The downtown buildings that supposedly generated Marina's trust fund income had been mortgaged and remortgaged until they were underwater. Elena discovered that my parents were living on borrowed time and borrowed money. The Elmwood Avenue mansion had 3 mortgages. The luxury cars we drove were leased under corporate names to hide personal debt. The private schools, charity galas, and lifestyle maintenance were being funded by increasingly creative financial maneuvers that couldn't continue indefinitely. Most disturbing of all, Elena found evidence that my parents had been discussing their options for reducing family expenses. In recorded phone conversations with financial advisors, Victor and Marina had explored the costs of maintaining 3 children versus 2. They'd researched boarding schools in other states, investigated legal guardianship transfers, and even consulted lawyers about the process of voluntarily surrendering parental rights. I was the target of these discussions, not Marcus, whose future success would reflect well on the family name, not Isabella, whose beauty and compliance made her an asset in social situations. Me, the daughter who asked uncomfortable questions, who preferred Elena's modest warmth to our family's cold perfection, who seemed incapable of becoming the person they needed me to be. Elena's documentation revealed that my parents viewed me as a liability they couldn't afford to maintain. In their minds, I was costing them money they didn't have while providing no return on investment in terms of family image or future success. The calculations were brutal in their precision: private school tuition, medical expenses, college savings, wedding costs, all weighed against the probability that I would never achieve the kind of success that would justify the expenditure. But Alina wasn't just documenting my parents' plans, she was making her own. Every Saturday when I visited, she was secretly preparing for the inevitable moment when Victor and Marina would make their choice. She was converting her assets to liquid form, setting up trust accounts and consulting lawyers about inheritance structures that my parents couldn't contest or control. Alina knew that my parents would eventually abandon me, and she was determined to ensure that when they did, I wouldn't be left with nothing. While they planned to cut me loose, she planned to catch me. While they calculated the cost of raising me, she calculated the investment required to give me a real future. The box in her closet contained more than just evidence of my parents' financial crimes and family secrets. It contained bank statements showing Elena's systematic saving, legal documents establishing my inheritance, and most importantly, letters she'd written to me over the years, letters my parents had intercepted and hidden, letters that proved I had never been unloved, just unloved by the wrong people. Elena had been fighting for me in ways I never knew, building a safety net I couldn't see, and preparing for a battle she hoped would never come. But as the financial pressures on my parents increased and their discussions about reducing expenses became more frequent, Elena understood that the confrontation was inevitable. What I couldn't have imagined during those innocent Saturday visits was that my grandmother was preparing for war. While I enjoyed her homemade cookies and listened to her stories, she was gathering ammunition against my parents, documenting their crimes, and building a fortress of legal protection around the granddaughter they were planning to sacrifice. Elena's love wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. She knew that loving me wouldn't be enough to protect me from Victor and Marina's calculations. She needed evidence, legal backing, and financial resources to ensure that when my parents revealed their true nature, I would have more than just heartbreak to sustain me. The Saturday visits that my parents barely tolerated were actually Elena's secret training sessions, preparing me for a reality I was too young to understand. Every story about helping vulnerable families, every lesson about recognizing predatory behavior, every conversation about standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves. Elena was teaching me to recognize the very patterns my parents embodied. Without realizing it, I was learning to see through the Vale family's carefully constructed facade. Elena's influence was slowly opening my eyes to the difference between genuine care and calculated manipulation, between real love and conditional approval, between family that supports you and family that uses you. By my 12th birthday, Elena had everything in place. Legal documents that would transfer significant assets to me if anything happened to her. Evidence that would expose my parents' business practices if they ever tried to claim her estate illegitimately. And most importantly, a letter explaining everything. A letter that would remain sealed unless and until the day came when I needed to understand who my real family was. That day was coming sooner than either of us realized. The crisis that would shatter my world arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, disguised as a routine breakfast conversation. I was 12 years old, sitting at our marble kitchen island eating cereal while reviewing my history homework, completely unaware that my parents had spent the previous night making decisions that would change my life forever. Victor entered the kitchen with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice tight with the kind of controlled panic I'd never heard from him before. "I don't care what the market conditions are, Bradley. We need that loan approved by Friday or the Riverside location shuts down." He ended the call and slammed the phone on the counter with enough force to make my cereal bowl jump. Marina appeared moments later, her usual morning composure replaced by something I'd never seen. Not the manageable anxiety of social obligations or charity committee politics, but raw, desperate fear that made her hands shake as she poured coffee. "How bad is it?" she asked Victor, her voice barely above a whisper. "Worse than we discussed," he replied, not bothering to lower his voice despite my presence. "The bank called the commercial loans, all of them. We have 30 days to pay back $2.3 million or they seize the dealership." I looked up from my homework, sensing something important was happening but not understanding the magnitude. Victor noticed my attention and shot Marina a warning look, but the damage was done. Their perfect facade was cracking, and for the first time in my life I was seeing them as they really were, people who were scared, desperate, and running out of options. The next few weeks transformed our house from a showcase of success into a war room of survival. Late-night phone calls replaced family dinners. Hushed conversations stopped abruptly when I entered rooms. Documents covered every surface of Victor's study, and the smell of stress sweat lingered in spaces that had always been pristine. Marcus and Isabella seemed oblivious to the crisis, protected by their status as the golden children who didn't need to understand adult problems. Marcus continued his lacrosse practices and college preparation activities, while Isabella maintained her schedule of lessons and playdates. But I couldn't ignore what was happening around me, and my questions made my parents increasingly uncomfortable. "Why are there strange men taking pictures of our cars?" I asked after school one day, having noticed investigators documenting the luxury vehicles in our drive. "Business matters, Cassandra," Marina snapped with unusual sharpness. "Nothing that concerns you, but everything concerned me, because I was starting to understand that I was part of their calculations in ways my siblings weren't." When Victor spoke on the phone about reducing overhead costs, his eyes followed me around the room. When Marina discussed difficult decisions with her sister, she glanced at me with an expression I was learning to recognize as resentment. The pressure reached a breaking point on the last Saturday in March, when I was supposed to visit Elena. Victor intercepted me at the front door, his face set in the cold determination I'd seen him use with difficult customers at the dealership. "You won't be visiting your grandmother anymore," he announced without preamble. I stared at him, confused. "Why not? Did something happen to Elena?" "Your grandmother has been filling your head with inappropriate ideas," Marina said, appearing beside Victor in a united front that felt rehearsed. "Ideas that don't align with our family values or expectations." "What ideas?" I asked, genuinely bewildered. "Elena and I talked about everything. Books, movies, her work stories, my school projects. Nothing we discussed seemed inappropriate or threatening." Victor's jaw tightened. "She's been teaching you to question authority, to sympathize with people who make poor life choices, to think that success is somehow wrong or immoral. That kind of thinking won't serve you well in the real world." The real reason, I would later learn, had nothing to do with Elena's influence on my worldview. Victor had discovered that Elena was asking questions about his business practices, calling former customers, and making inquiries that could expose the predatory lending schemes keeping his dealerships afloat. Elena represented a threat to their survival, and by extension, so did my relationship with her. "I don't understand," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "Elena loves me. She's family." "Family," Marina repeated, her tone suggesting the word tasted bitter. "Cassandra, you need to understand something about family loyalty. Real family supports each other during difficult times. Real family doesn't ask questions that could hurt the people they love." The implication was clear. By maintaining my relationship with Elena, by enjoying her company and valuing her perspectives, I was betraying my parents when they needed my support most. It was my first lesson in emotional manipulation, though I didn't have the vocabulary to name it at the time. "But I want to see Elena," I insisted, my 12-year-old understanding of fairness demanding that I be allowed to maintain the relationship that brought me the most joy. "She's not hurting anyone." Victor stepped closer, using his height to intimidate me in a way that felt both familiar and newly threatening. "You will not see her again, Cassandra. You will not call her, write to her, or contact her in any way. If you disobey us on this, there will be serious consequences." "What kind of consequences?" I asked, though something in his tone made me afraid to hear the answer. Marina and Victor exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. "The kind that would make you very unhappy," Marina said finally. "Trust us, Cassandra. We're trying to protect you from making a mistake that could affect your entire future." That night, I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what had just happened. Elena was the one person in my life who made me feel completely accepted and loved without condition. She was my sanctuary from the performance anxiety that characterized every other relationship in my family. Taking her away felt like removing the only source of oxygen in a room that was already suffocating me. But something else was bothering me, the way my parents had delivered their ultimatum. There was a desperation underneath their authority that I'd never seen before, a sense that they were fighting for their lives and willing to sacrifice anything or anyone to win. Over the following days, I tested their resolve with small acts of rebellion. I asked about Elena during dinner. I mentioned wanting to call her. I suggested that maybe we could invite her over for Easter. Each time, my parents' reactions grew more severe. Victor's voice got colder. Marina's smiles became more forced, and both of them started looking at me with an expression I was beginning to recognize as calculation. The final test came when I found Elena's phone number in the kitchen drawer and tried to call her while my parents were out. The phone had been disconnected, not Elena's phone but our house phone's ability to call her number specifically. Victor had contacted the phone company and blocked all communication with Elena's number, proving that this wasn't about protecting me from bad influences. This was about isolation and control. When I confronted my parents about the phone block, their masks slipped completely. "You just couldn't leave it alone, could you?" Victor said, his voice carrying a threat that made my stomach clench with fear. "You had to keep pushing, keep questioning our decisions, keep proving that you can't be trusted to follow simple instructions." Marina nodded in agreement. "We've been very patient with you, Cassandra, but your behavior is becoming a problem, a serious problem that affects this entire family." "I just want to talk to Elena," I said, tears starting to fall despite my efforts to appear strong. "I don't understand why that's so wrong." "Because," Victor said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting, "sometimes families have to make hard choices. Sometimes maintaining family unity requires sacrifices, and sometimes the people who claim to love you are actually working against your best interests." I didn't understand then that they were describing themselves, not Elena. I didn't realize that the hard choices they were discussing had already been made, and that I was the sacrifice they'd decided was necessary for their survival. The pressure was building towards something I couldn't yet see, but I could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon, dark, inevitable, and destructive enough to change everything I thought I knew about love, family, and my place in the world. The moment that would define my entire life arrived on a Thursday afternoon in April, wrapped in the deceptive normalcy of after-school homework time. I was sitting in the living room working on a social studies project about family trees, when Victor and Marina entered with the kind of coordinated precision that meant they'd been planning this conversation for days. "Cassandra, we need to talk," Marina said, settling into the chair across from me with the careful posture she used for serious discussion. Victor remained standing, positioning himself by the fireplace in what I now recognize was a deliberate power move designed to make me feel small and cornered. "About what?" I asked, though something in their combined energy made my stomach tighten with anticipation. Victor cleared his throat with the formality he used for business presentations. "Your mother and I have been discussing your future, and we've made some important decisions that will affect our entire family." The word decisions hung in the air like a threat. In 12 years of living with the Vales, I'd learned that when my parents made decisions about my life, they rarely involved my input or considered my preferences. But this felt different, heavier, more fine. "We've enrolled you at Riverside Residential Academy," Marina announced, producing a glossy brochure from seemingly nowhere. "It's a prestigious boarding school in Vermont with an excellent academic program and structured environment that will help you develop better discipline and focus." I stared at the brochure, trying to process what I was hearing. Riverside Residential Academy looked like a cross between a prison and a hospital, stark buildings surrounded by chain-link fences, with promotional photos of students in identical uniforms sitting in perfectly straight rows. "Boarding school," I repeated, "but I don't want to go to boarding school. I want to stay here with my family." Victor's expression didn't change. "What you want isn't the primary consideration here, Cassandra. What matters is what's best for your development, and what's best for this family overall." "But why?" I asked, my voice rising with panic I couldn't control. "Did I do something wrong? Are you mad about Elena? Because I promise I won't try to contact her anymore if that's what this is about." Marina leaned forward with practiced sympathy. "This isn't about punishment, sweetheart. This is about opportunity. Riverside will give you structure and guidance that we can't provide at home. You'll make new friends, develop better study habits, and learn to be more independent." Every word felt like a lie. I could see in their eyes that this wasn't about opportunity or development. This was about removal. This was about solving a problem, and I was the problem they were solving. "When," I whispered, afraid to hear the answer. Monday, Victor replied without hesitation. We've already completed all the paperwork and arrangements. Your bags will be packed this weekend. Monday, 4 days. I felt like the floor was dissolving beneath me, like everything solid in my world was turning to quicksand. But that's so soon. What about finishing the school year? What about my friends? What about what, Cassandra? Victor interrupted, his patience clearly exhausted. What about your refusal to follow simple instructions? What about your constant questioning of our authority? What about your inability to understand that families make sacrifices for each other? The word sacrifices hit me like a physical blow. Not we're making sacrifices for you, but families make sacrifices, meaning I was the sacrifice being made. I don't understand, I said, tears starting to fall despite my efforts to remain calm. Why are you sending me away? What did I do that was so terrible? Marina reached over and took my hands, her touch feeling cold and clinical. You didn't do anything terrible, Cassandra, but you're at an age where you need more guidance than we can provide. Your relationship with Elena has given you some confused ideas about how the world works. Riverside will help correct those misconceptions. The truth behind her words was becoming clear. This wasn't about my behavior or my development. This was about Elena. This was about silencing the one person who might expose Victor's business practices, and removing me from the equation was the simplest way to ensure my silence. What if I refused to? I asked, my 12-year-old sense of justice demanding that I have some choice in determining my own future. Victor's mask of parental concern finally slipped completely. You don't have a choice, Cassandra. You're a minor child, and we are your legal guardian. We have the right and responsibility to make decisions about your care, education, and living arrangements. You will go to Riverside whether you cooperate or not. But what about Marcus and Isabella? I demanded, gesturing toward the stairs where my siblings were presumably doing homework in their own rooms. Why aren't they going to boarding school? Why am I the only one who needs this opportunity? Marina and Victor exchanged the kind of look that communicated volumes without words. Marcus and Isabella are different, Marina said finally. They've proven they can thrive in our home environment. They understand family loyalty and respect for authority. They don't require the same level of intervention. The word intervention felt like a slip. I was being treated like a problem child, a troubled kid who needed to be institutionalized, when my only crime had been loving my grandmother and asking questions my parents found inconvenient. This is about money, isn't it? I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. You're having financial problems and you need to reduce expenses, so you're getting rid of me. The silence that followed was deafening. Victor's face went white with rage, while Marina's composure cracked just enough to reveal the panic underneath. How dare you? Victor whispered, his voice carrying a menace that made me shrink back into the couch. How dare you suggest that we would make decisions about our children based on financial considerations? But I could see the truth in their faces. I could see the calculations, the cost-benefit analysis, the cold determination to prioritize Marcus and Isabella's futures over mine. Boarding school wasn't about giving me opportunities. It was about removing me from their financial obligations while maintaining plausible deniability about their motives. You are, I said with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes with profound betrayal. You're sending me away because you can't afford to keep me. Marina stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. That's enough, Cassandra. You're being dramatic and disrespectful, which only proves that we're making the right decision. The right decision for who? I shot back, my fear transforming into anger. The right decision for you, maybe. But what about what's right for me? What about what I want? What about the fact that I love you and want to stay here? Victor stepped closer, using his height and bulk to intimidate me in a way that crossed the line from parental authority into something darker. What you want is irrelevant, Cassandra. You're a child who has proven she can't make good decisions or follow simple rules. This family has invested considerable time and resources in trying to help you develop proper values and behavior, but you've consistently rejected our guidance. I haven't rejected anything, I protested, my voice breaking with emotion. I've tried to be good. I get good grades. I don't get in trouble at school. I help around the house. You defied our direct orders about Elena, Marina interrupted coldly. You questioned our business practices. You made us feel unwelcome in our own home with your constant criticism and negativity. The accusations felt surreal, like they were describing a different child entirely. I had never criticized their business practices because I didn't understand them. I had never made them feel unwelcome. I had simply asked questions and sought connections that made me feel less alone. I just wanted to see my grandmother, I whispered. The fight draining out of me as I realized how futile this conversation was. They had already made their decision. The boarding school was already arranged. My bags would be packed whether I cooperated or not. Your grandmother, Victor said with contempt, filled your head with socialist nonsense about helping people who refuse to help themselves. She taught you to question success, to sympathize with failure, to think that achievement is somehow morally wrong. Those ideas have no place in this family. I stared at him, finally understanding that they weren't just sending me away, they were rejecting everything I was, and everything I value. Elena's love, my curiosity about the world, my empathy for people who struggled, all of it was wrong in their eyes. All of it needed to be corrected or eliminated. Fine, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Send me to boarding school. But don't pretend this is about helping me or giving me opportunities. This is about getting rid of the daughter who doesn't fit your perfect family image. Victor's hand moved so quickly I barely saw it coming. The slap across my face was sharp and precise, calculated to hurt without leaving visible marks. I touched my cheek in shock, staring at the man who had just crossed a line we could never uncross. You will not speak to us that way, he said quietly. You will go to your room and you will think very carefully about the choices that brought us to this point. Monday morning, you will get in the car with dignity and gratitude for the opportunity we're providing you. I stood up slowly, my cheek burning with the handprint of his rejection. And if I don't? Marina answered this time, her voice carrying a finality that chilled me to the bone. Then you'll learn that families who can't function together sometimes have to be permanently separated. The threat was unmistakable. Cooperate with the boarding school plan or face something even worse, complete abandonment. Total rejection. Erasure from the family entirely. I walked to my room in a daze, finally understanding that I had never been their daughter in any meaningful sense. I had been a project, an investment, a reflection of their parenting skills. And when the project failed to yield the desired results, when the investment stopped paying dividends, when the reflection showed something they didn't want to see, I became expendable. The point of no return had been reached, and I was about to discover just how far my parents were willing to go to protect their perfect world from the daughter who had never belonged in it. That Friday morning, I stood in the circular driveway of the only home I'd ever known, watching Victor load my hastily packed suitcases into the trunk of his BMW with the same efficiency he used for business transactions. The boarding school departure had been moved up from Monday to Friday, a change my parents claimed was for administrative convenience, but which I understood was motivated by their fear that I might find a way to contact Elena or cause a scene that would embarrass them in front of the neighbors. The ride to Riverside Residential Academy took 4 hours, during which Marina maintained a stream of cheerful commentary about the opportunities that awaited me, while Victor focused on the road with grim determination. They spoke about me as if I weren't sitting in the back seat, discussing my adjustment period and behavior modification goals with the clinical detachment of people dropping off a problem pet at a camp. The administrators assure us that most students adapt within the first semester, Marina said, consulting a folder of paperwork. The structured environment and consistent consequences help children learn appropriate boundaries and respect for authority. I stared out the window at the passing landscape, watching familiar Connecticut suburbs give way to rural Vermont wilderness. Each mile took me further from everything I'd ever known, and closer to a future that felt like punishment for crimes I couldn't identify. The mountains grew taller and more forbidding, reflecting the isolation that was settling over me like a suffocating blanket. Riverside Residential Academy looked exactly like its brochure, institutional, sterile, and designed to contain rather than nurture. The buildings were gray concrete blocks surrounded by tall fences topped with decorative spikes that managed to look both welcoming and threatening. Students moved between buildings in orderly lines, their identical uniforms and synchronized movements, giving the place an eerie military precision. Dr. Helena Whitmore, the intake administrator, greeted us in a reception area that felt more like a medical facility than a school. She was a thin woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes, the professional expression of someone who specialized in managing difficult children and desperate parents. "Mr. and Miss Veal," she said, shaking hands with my parents while barely acknowledging my presence. "We're so pleased to welcome Cassandra to our community. I think you'll find that our program provides exactly the kind of guidance she needs." While the adults discussed my case in euphemisms and educational jargon, I found myself studying the other families in the waiting area. They all had the same hollow-eyed desperation as my parents, well-dressed people who had reached the end of their patience and decided that paying someone else to deal with their problematic children was preferable to addressing the real issues in their family. The intake process was designed to strip away any sense of personal agency or control. My belongings were searched and cataloged. Items deemed inappropriate were confiscated, including a photo of Elena that I'd hidden in my geometry textbook and a small wooden angel she'd given me for my 11th birthday. When I protested, Dr. Whitmore explained that external attachments could interfere with the therapeutic process. "Your parents have provided us with detailed information about your behavioral challenges," she said, reading from a file that Victor and Marina had apparently been compiling without my knowledge. "Defiance of parental authority, inappropriate social attachments, tendency toward emotional manipulation, and resistance to family values integration." Each phrase felt like another nail in the coffin of my identity. The girl they were describing sounded like a troubled delinquent, not a 12-year-old who had asked too many questions and loved the wrong person. But I was beginning to understand that rewriting my story was part of the process, turning me into a problem that required institutional intervention, rather than a daughter who had been abandoned for financial convenience. The moment that truly marked the beginning of my exile came when it was time for my parents to leave. I had expected some emotional farewell, perhaps tears or apologies or promises to visit soon. Instead, Marina gave me a brief, perfunctory hug while Victor shook my hand like I was a business associate. "Remember what we discussed about making good choices," Victor said, his voice carrying the same tone he used with difficult customers. "This is an opportunity for you to prove that you can learn and grow." "When will you visit?" I asked, my voice small and desperate despite my efforts to appear strong. Marina and Victor exchanged a look that I was learning to recognize as calculation. "We'll see how your adjustment goes," Marina said carefully. "Dr. Whitmore will keep us informed of your progress, and will make decisions about visitation based on how well you're responding to the program." The message was clear. My parents' presence in my life would be conditional on my compliance with a system designed to break my spirit and remake me in their image. If I caused problems, asked uncomfortable questions, or failed to demonstrate sufficient gratitude for my exile, they would simply disappear entirely. As their BMW pulled away from the academy's entrance, I felt something inside me break that would never fully heal. The parents who had raised me, fed me, housed me, and claimed to love me had just walked away without looking back, leaving me with strangers who viewed me as a behavioral problem to be solved rather than a child to be nurtured. The first few weeks at Riverside were a masterclass in institutional dehumanization. Everything was designed to break down individual identity and replace it with compliance. We woke at 5:30 a.m. to bells. We marched to meals in silence. We studied predetermined curricula that emphasized obedience over critical thinking. We went to bed at 9 p.m. after mandatory reflection time, where we were required to write essays about our behavioral improvements and gratitude for the opportunity to be reformed. My roommate was a girl named Sarah Chen, whose parents had sent her away for the crime of wanting to study art instead of pre-med. We bonded over our shared understanding that we weren't troubled kids who needed fixing. We were inconvenient children whose families had chosen institutional solutions over genuine relationships. "The trick," Sarah told me during one of our whispered late-night conversations, "is to become invisible. Give them the compliance they want without losing yourself completely." play the game until you're old enough to leave. But playing the game meant betraying everything Elena had taught me about authenticity, empathy, and standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves. It meant pretending that my parents' abandonment was justified, that my love for Elena was inappropriate, and that my questions about fairness and justice were character flaws to be corrected. The letters from home came sporadically and felt increasingly scripted. Marina would write about Marcus's lacrosse achievements and Isabella's piano recitals, creating a picture of family life continuing seamlessly without me. Victor would include brief notes about the importance of taking advantage of my educational opportunities and making the family proud through my improved behavior. Neither parent ever mentioned Elaine. Neither asked about my feelings, my friendships, or my adjustment beyond the clinical reports they received from Dr. Whitmore. I existed for them only as a problem being solved in their absence, a burden they had successfully transferred to professional handling. The most devastating blow came 6 weeks into my stay, when a letter arrived that wasn't from my parents but from a lawyer in Millbrook. Elena had suffered a massive heart attack and been hospitalized. By the time the letter reached me through the academy's mail screening process, she had already died and been buried. I had missed her final days, her funeral, and any chance to say goodbye to the only person who had ever loved me unconditionally. When I called home that night, my first phone call since arriving, Marina answered with the casual tone she used for routine business. "Oh yes, we heard about Elena," she said when I managed to stop crying long enough to ask why no one had told me. "We didn't want to upset you during your adjustment period. Dr. Whitmore thought it would be better to let you focus on your progress. She was my grandmother," I sobbed into the phone. "She loved me. I should have been at her funeral." "Cassandra," Marina said with growing impatience, "you need to understand that Elena's death doesn't change anything about your situation. Dwelling on the past won't help you move forward. Dr. Whitmore says you've been making good progress, and we don't want this setback to undo all your hard work." The casual cruelty of her response, treating Elena's death as a potential setback to my behavioral modification, finally made me understand the complete depth of my abandonment. I wasn't just physically separated from my family, I had been emotionally erased from their lives. Elena's death was an inconvenience to be managed, not a loss to be grieved. That night I lay in my narrow dormitory bed, and made a promise to myself and to Elena's memory. I would survive this place. I would play their games and meet their expectations, but I would never forget who I really was underneath the compliance they demanded. And someday, when I was old enough and strong enough, I would find a way to honor the love Elena had given me, and the truth she had tried to teach me about real family. The exile had begun, but it wouldn't last forever. I just had to survive long enough to reclaim my life on my own terms. The next 4 years at Riverside became a masterclass in psychological endurance that would have broken a weaker person. What I didn't know then was that every moment of institutional cruelty, every night of crying myself to sleep, every day of forced compliance was building the steel spine I would need to survive what came next. By my 14th birthday, I had learned to navigate Riverside's complex system of rewards and punishments with the calculating precision of a prisoner of war. The academy operated on a points system where compliance earned privileges like extended library time or weekend movie access, while infractions resulted in isolation, extra chores, or loss of basic comfort. I became expert at appearing reformed while maintaining my inner rebellion, a skill that would prove invaluable in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Sarah Chen had been my lifeline during those first brutal months, but she aged out at 17 and left for college with promises to stay in touch that gradually faded into silence. Her departure left me more isolated than ever, surrounded by newer students who hadn't yet learned that survival meant keeping your real thoughts buried deep beneath layers of institutional approved behavior. The academic program at Riverside was designed to produce compliant workers rather than critical thinkers. We studied sanitized versions of history that emphasized obedience to authority, literature that celebrated conformity over individualism, and social studies that reinforced existing power structures without questioning their fairness. Any student who asked probing questions or challenged approved narratives quickly found themselves in Dr. Whitmore's office for attitude adjustment sessions, but the library became my sanctuary and secret classroom. Hidden among the approved texts were books that had somehow escaped the administration's censorship, works on social justice, biographies of people who had fought against unfair systems, and most importantly, legal texts that taught me about rights, and the ways power could be challenged through law rather than force. During my third year, I discovered that Elena had been right about more than just my parents' character. While researching inheritance law for a paper on family structures, I stumbled across public records showing that Elena had indeed left me a substantial inheritance, money that my parents had somehow gained control of during my institutionalization. The records were complex and partially sealed, but they revealed enough to confirm that my exile wasn't just about reducing expenses. It was about accessing money that legally belonged to me. The revelation was devastating and energizing in equal measure. Elena had tried to protect me from exactly the situation I found myself in, but my parents had outmaneuvered a dead woman and a powerless child with legal maneuvers I was only beginning to understand. The inheritance that should have provided security for my future was being used to fund Marcus's Ivy League education and Isabella's expensive private schools, while I learned to survive on institutional meals and second-hand uniforms. Determining to honor Elena's memory and protect what remained of my inheritance, I began teaching myself law with the same intensity I'd once applied to surviving Dr. Whitmore's behavior modification program. I spent every free moment in the library, reading cases about inheritance fraud, educational neglect and parental financial abuse. I learned about statute of limitations, fiduciary duty, and the rights of minor children to access their own assets, but knowledge without power meant nothing. At 15, I was still legally under my parents' control, still dependent on their financial support for basic necessities, still trapped in an institution they controlled through their checkbook. Every month, Victor dutifully paid Riverside's fees, while writing brief letters about my progress and the family's investment in my rehabilitation. The breaking point came during the summer before my junior year, when Riverside implemented a new family integration program designed to rebuild relationships between students and their parents. The program required monthly video calls where families would discuss the students' progress and plan for eventual reintegration into family life. The first call with my parents in 2 years was a masterpiece of calculated cruelty disguised as therapeutic intervention. Victor and Marina sat in their familiar living room, the same living room where they had announced my exile, smiling with the practiced warmth they used for business associates. Behind them I could see new furniture, fresh paint, and expensive artwork that my inheritance money had almost certainly funded. Cassandra looked so mature. Marina cooed to Dr. Whitmore, who supervised the call to ensure productive communication. The structure at Riverside has obviously been very beneficial for her development. We're very proud of the progress reports we've received, Victor added, consulting notes that made it clear he'd prepared for this conversation like a business meeting. Her improved attitude and respect for authority show that our investment in her education has been worthwhile. They spoke about me in the third person even though I was sitting right there discussing my behavioral improvements and attitude adjustments, as if I were a broken appliance that had finally been repaired to their specifications. When Dr. Whitmore prompted them to address me directly, their questions were scripted and superficial. How were my grades? Was I making friends? Did I appreciate the opportunities they were providing? Not once did they ask if I missed them. Not once did they express love or regret about our separation. Not once did they mention Elena or acknowledge that I had lost the most important person in my life while trapped in institutional isolation. But the worst moment came when Dr. Whitmore asked about plans for my eventual return home. The silence that followed was profound enough to communicate volumes. Finally, Victor cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "We think Cassandra would benefit from completing her education at Riverside," he said carefully. "The stability and structure seem to be working well for her, and we wouldn't want to disrupt her progress by changing environments too quickly." The translation was clear. They had no intention of ever bringing me home. Riverside wasn't rehabilitation. It was permanent warehouse. They planned to keep me institutionalized until I aged out at 18. At which point I would become someone else's problem rather than returning to disrupt their perfect family dynamic. That night I sat in my dormitory room and wrote a letter I would never send, a letter to Elaine, telling her about the family she had tried to protect me from, about the inheritance she had left me that was being stolen, about the granddaughter she had loved who was learning to survive in a world that seemed designed to break her spirit. The act of writing to Elena, even knowing she would never read my words, connected me to the love and strength she had tried to give me. In that letter I made promises that would shape the rest of my life. I would not let my parents destroy me. I would not accept their narrative about my worthlessness. I would find a way to honor Elena's love by becoming someone strong enough to fight for herself and others who couldn't fight back. The darkest period came during my senior year, when the reality of aging out with nowhere to go became impossible to ignore. While other students prepared for college with family support and financial backing, I faced the prospect of turning 18 with no home, no family, and no access to the inheritance that should have provided security for my future. Dr. Whitmore's solution was typically institutional. A transition program that would move me from residential school to supervised independent living, with continued therapy to help me adjust to adult responsibilities. The program was designed for students whose families couldn't or wouldn't take them back, a category that apparently included children whose parents found permanent institutionalization more convenient than actual relationship. But I had learned something during my years at Riverside that Dr. Whitmore and my parents hadn't anticipated. I had learned to be patient, strategic, and completely ruthless when necessary. The compliance they had demanded from me wasn't submission, it was camouflage. The behavioral modification they celebrated wasn't genuine change. It was preparation for war. On my 18th birthday, when I would finally gain legal control over my own life, I would have more than just freedom. I would have 4 years of legal education, detailed knowledge of my parents' financial crimes, and the cold determination of someone who had been abandoned by people who should have protected her. Elena's inheritance might have been stolen, but Elena's love had taught me something my parents never understood. Real strength comes not from control or manipulation, but from the ability to survive anything, and still choose kindness over cruelty, justice over revenge. I was no longer the 12-year-old girl they had discarded. I was becoming someone they had never imagined, and would never see coming. Freedom arrived on a gray March morning 3 days after my 18th birthday, not with celebration but with the cold efficiency of institutional discharge. I walked out of Riverside Residential Academy carrying everything I owned in 2 worn suitcases and a backpack, with $847 in saved allowance money, and a head full of legal knowledge that would soon prove more valuable than any traditional inheritance. The transition house in Burlington, Vermont was supposed to be a stepping stone, a place where former institutional students learned to navigate independent living with continued supervision and support. But I had no intention of remaining dependent on systems designed to control rather than empower. Within a week of moving into my assigned room, I had applied for every scholarship, grant, and work-study program available to students aging out of residential care. My first breakthrough came through an unexpected source, Mrs. Eleanor Hartford, a retired law professor who volunteered with the Vermont Legal Aid Society. She had been assigned as my transition counselor, a role that typically involved teaching basic life skills like budgeting and job application. But during our initial meeting, when she asked about my goals, I surprised her with a detailed explanation of inheritance law and my plans to challenge my parents' financial manipulation. "You've taught yourself quite a bit," she said, reviewing the notes I'd compiled about Elena's estate and my parents' suspicious access to funds that should have been held in trust. "But self-taught legal knowledge has limitations. You need professional guidance if you're going to challenge people with the resources your parents seem to have." Miss Hartford became my first real mentor since Elena, not because she felt sorry for me, but because she recognized something Elena had seen years earlier, a fierce intelligence that had been sharpened rather than dulled by adversity. She arranged for me to audit law classes at the University of Vermont while working part-time at the legal aid office, learning to research cases and prepare documents for attorneys who served clients too poor to afford private representation. The work was methodical and often tedious, scanning documents, organizing case files, and conducting research on legal precedents, but it gave me practical experience with the legal system and access to resources I never could have afforded on my own. More importantly, it connected me with David Chen, a young associate attorney who specialized in inheritance disputes and elder abuse cases. David was Sarah Chen's older brother, the same Sarah who had been my roommate during my first year at Riverside. When he learned about my connection to his sister and heard my story, he agreed to review Elena's estate documents on a pro bono basis. What he discovered exceeded even my suspicions about my parents' financial manipulation. "This is fraud," David said bluntly during our first formal consultation. "Clear, documented, criminal fraud. Your grandmother established a trust specifically to protect your inheritance from exactly this kind of parental interference, but your parents used your institutionalization to gain unauthorized access to funds that should have been untouchable." The evidence was damning when assembled by someone who understood legal procedure. Elena had worked with her estate attorney to create a trust that would provide for my education, housing, and basic needs, while preserving the principal amount for my adult independence. The trust documents explicitly stated that funds could only be accessed for my direct benefit, with detailed reporting requirements and third-party oversight, but Victor and Marina had exploited loopholes in the system designed to protect minor children. By having me institutionalized and claiming financial hardship, they had convinced a probate judge to authorize emergency access to trust funds for my specialized educational needs. The $15,000 annual cost of Riverside was technically a legitimate educational expense, but the additional $300,000 they had withdrawn over 6 years had been diverted to their personal use. David's investigation revealed that my parents had used my inheritance money to renovate their house, purchase new luxury vehicles, and fund Marcus and Isabella's private education. They had essentially stolen my future to maintain their lifestyle while keeping me imprisoned in an institution that served their convenience rather than my needs. "The statute of limitations works in your favor," David explained. "Since you were a minor when the fraud occurred and had no way to discover it while institutionalized, the clock didn't start running until you gained legal capacity to act. We have solid grounds for both civil recovery and criminal charge." But pursuing justice required more than just legal grounds. It required financial resources for court costs, investigative expenses, and expert witnesses. David was willing to work pro bono, but a case this complex would require substantial upfront investment that I simply didn't. That's when Mrs. Hartford introduced me to something I hadn't known existed: the Vermont Justice Foundation, an organization that provided funding for legal cases involving systemic abuse of vulnerable populations. My case fit their mission perfectly: a young adult seeking to recover inheritance funds stolen through institutional manipulation and parental fraud. The foundation's review board consisted of retired judges, social workers, and attorneys who had seen countless cases of family financial abuse. When I presented my evidence and testified about my parents' systematic isolation and control, their decision was unanimous. They would fund the case as both a matter of individual justice and a precedent for protecting other young people from similar exploitation. With legal representation secured and funding approved, I faced a choice that would define my adult life. I could pursue a quiet settlement that would recover my stolen inheritance without public exposure of my parents' crime, or I could demand full accountability, including criminal charges that would destroy their reputation and social standing while ensuring they could never victimize another child the way they had victimized me. The decision was easier than I expected. Elena's love had taught me to value justice over revenge, but it had also taught me that protecting vulnerable people sometimes required confronting powerful ones. My parents had built their comfortable life on the systematic abuse of people who couldn't fight back, their predatory business practices, their exploitation of my inheritance, their abandonment of a child who needed protection rather than punishment. "File the criminal complaint," I told Dave. "I want full prosecution and public accountability. They need to face consequences for what they've done, and other families need to see that this kind of abuse has real costs." The moment I signed the formal complaint, I crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I was no longer a victim seeking to quietly recover what had been stolen from me. I was a prosecutor seeking justice for crimes that had been hidden behind closed doors and institutional walls. The first victory came just 6 weeks later when the Vermont Attorney General's office announced that Victor and Marina Vale had been indicted on charges of inheritance fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit theft. The news broke in the Millbrook newspapers with headlines that shattered their carefully maintained reputation and exposed the ugly reality behind their perfect family facade. But the real victory wasn't legal or financial, it was personal. For the first time since Elena's death, I felt connected to something larger than my own survival. I was fighting not just for my inheritance, but for every child who had been abandoned by parents who viewed them as inconvenient, every vulnerable person who had been exploited by those in positions of trust. The scared 12-year-old who had been discarded at Riverside was gone. In her place stood someone who understood that real power came not from control or manipulation, but from the courage to demand justice even when it cost everything. My parents were about to discover that the daughter they had thrown away had grown into someone they had never imagined. Someone strong enough to hold them accountable for every lie, every theft, every moment of cruelty they had inflicted in pursuit of their perfect life. The first victory was just the beginning. The criminal trial of Victor and Marina Vale became the most sensational legal story Millbrook had seen in decades, and I found myself at the center of a media firestorm that transformed me from anonymous victim to public advocate for children's rights and inheritance protection. What had started as personal justice evolved into something far more significant. A landmark case that would change how courts handled parental financial abuse and institutional abandonment. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness. David Chen and the Attorney General's team had uncovered not just my parents' theft of Elena's inheritance, but a pattern of financial manipulation that extended back years before my birth. They had exploited Elena's trust and affection, borrowing against her property when their businesses struggled, then systematically isolating her from family members who might have questioned their management of her affairs. Expert witnesses testified about the sophisticated nature of their fraud. Financial analysts traced the movement of trust funds through shell companies and dummy accounts designed to obscure the theft. Child welfare specialists explained how my institutionalization had been used as a tool of financial control, keeping me isolated while my inheritance was systematically plundered. Elder abuse specialists described how my parents had manipulated Elena's grief over losing contact with me to gain access to her assets. But the most powerful testimony came from Dr. Marcus Holloway, a respected child psychologist who had reviewed my Riverside records and interviewed me extensively about my experiences. His analysis of my parents' behavior was clinical and damning. The defendants exhibited a pattern of systematic emotional and financial abuse designed to isolate the victim from all sources of support while exploiting her vulnerability for personal gain. He testified. Their decision to institutionalize Cassandra was not motivated by concern for her welfare, but by their desire to access her inheritance without interference from the child who legally owned it. The defense attempted to portray Victor and Marina as loving parents who had made difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. They claimed financial desperation had driven them to make temporary loans from the trust that they had always intended to repay. They painted my institutionalization as a last resort for parents overwhelmed by a troubled child who refused to accept family authority. But the evidence told a different story. Phone recordings revealed them laughing about that inheritance windfall and discussing how to keep the kid quiet while they accessed the money. Bank records showed luxury purchases made with trust funds during the same weeks they claimed financial desperation. Most damaging of all, their own communications revealed they had researched ways to permanently surrender parental rights, viewing my complete abandonment as the ultimate solution to their inconvenient daughter problem. The trial lasted 6 weeks and made national news. Legal experts called it a watershed moment for inheritance protection and children's rights. Victim advocacy groups held vigils outside the courthouse. Former Riverside students came forward with their own stories of institutional abuse and family abandonment, creating a movement that would eventually lead to reforms in residential care regulations. But the personal cost of being in the public eye was enormous. Every detail of my childhood, every moment of pain and abandonment, became material for newspaper articles and television interviews. Reporters camped outside my apartment building. Social media accounts dedicated to the case analyzed my testimony and debated whether I was a brave survivor or an ungrateful daughter seeking revenge. The verdict came on a Friday in October, guilty on all counts. Victor was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for inheritance fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. Marina received 6 years for her role in the conspiracy and financial manipulation. The judge's statement during sentencing became widely quoted in legal circles. The defendants systematically betrayed every trust placed in them as parents, as caregivers to an elderly family member, and as stewards of a child's future. Judge Patricia Morrison said, "Their crimes were not committed in a moment of desperation but through years of calculated exploitation of the most vulnerable people in their lives. This court finds their behavior not merely criminal but profoundly evil in its deliberate cruelty." The financial recovery exceeded everyone's expectations. In addition to the stolen inheritance principle, the court awarded punitive damages, interest, and compensation for emotional trauma that brought the total judgment. But more importantly, Elena's original trust structure was restored, ensuring that the money would be protected and properly managed for my future needs. With the legal victory secured, I faced choices about my future that I had never expected to have. The settlement money provided financial security I had never imagined possible, but more importantly, the case had connected me with a network of legal professionals who recognized my unusual combination of personal experience and legal knowledge. David Chen offered me a position as a paralegal specializing in inheritance disputes and family financial abuse cases. Mrs. Hartford arranged for me to audit additional law school courses while working, putting me on track to eventually take the LSAT and pursue formal legal education. The Vermont Justice Foundation invited me to join their board as an advocate for young adult survivors of institutional abuse. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source: the Cassandra Vale Foundation for Children's Rights, established by the settlement funds, specifically to help other young people challenge parental financial abuse and institutional neglect. The foundation provided legal assistance, investigation resources, and emotional support for children whose families had exploited their vulnerability for personal gain. My first case as a foundation advocate involved a 16-year-old boy whose parents had institutionalized him to access his grandfather's trust fund, using remarkably similar tactics to what my parents had employed. Working with David Chen and a team of investigative specialists, we uncovered evidence of fraud that led to criminal charges and recovery of stolen assets worth over. The success of that case brought media attention that established me as a leading advocate for children's inheritance rights. Law schools invited me to speak about institutional abuse and financial exploitation. Legal conferences featured my story as a case study in survivor advocacy. The American Bar Association recognized my work with an award for outstanding contribution to children's legal rights. But the recognition that meant the most came in the form of letters, hundreds of them, from young people who had read about my case and recognized their own experiences of family abandonment and financial exploitation. They wrote about parents who had stolen their college funds, grandparents who had been isolated and manipulated, siblings who had been discarded when they became inconvenient. Each letter reminded me that my victory was not just personal, it was part of a larger struggle to protect vulnerable people from those who would exploit their trust and dependence. Elena's love had saved me not just through her inheritance, but through the example she had set of fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. By my 21st birthday, I had helped recover over $2.3 million in stolen inheritance funds for young survivors of family financial abuse. The Cassandra Vale Foundation had become a national resource for legal professionals handling complex inheritance disputes. My own story had been featured in law school textbooks and professional journals as a precedent for holding parents accountable for systematic financial exploitation. More importantly, I had built a life that honored Elena's memory while healing the wounds my parents had inflicted. I had close relationships with colleagues who respected my professional abilities rather than merely tolerating my presence. I had work that gave meaning to my suffering by transforming it into protection for others. I had financial security that enabled me to make choices based on principle rather than desperation. The scared, abandoned child who had been discarded at Riverside was gone. In her place stood someone who had turned trauma into expertise, isolation into independence, and victimhood into advocacy. I had not just survived my parents' cruelty, I had transformed it into a force for justice that was protecting other children from similar exploitation. But I was about to discover that Victor and Marina Vale had one more surprise waiting for me. a surprise that would test everything I had learned about power, justice, and the complicated nature of family relationships that could never be completely severed. Success had given me everything I thought I wanted: financial security, professional respect, the power to protect other vulnerable children from the kind of exploitation I had endured. But at 24, living alone in my spacious apartment in downtown Burlington with walls covered in awards and commendations, I found myself confronting an emptiness that no amount of professional achievement could fill. The Elena Vale Foundation had become my life's work, my family, and my identity. I worked 12-hour days, traveled constantly for speaking engagements and legal conferences, and poured every ounce of emotional energy into cases that reminded me daily of my own trauma. The work was meaningful and necessary, but it was also isolating in ways I hadn't anticipated. My colleagues respected me professionally, but friendships were complicated by the intensity of my reputation and the dark nature of my expertise. Dating was nearly impossible. Most people either treated me like a curiosity because of the media coverage, or backed away once they understood the depth of family dysfunction that had shaped my life. I had built a fortress of professional accomplishment around myself, but fortresses designed to keep danger out also keep connection from getting in. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had become an expert on family relationships while having no functional family of my own. I helped other young people navigate complex emotional terrain with parents who had betrayed their trust, but I had no model for what healthy family connection actually looked like. Elena's love had saved me, but it had been cut short before I could learn how to maintain relationships through conflict, forgiveness, and the ordinary friction of ongoing connection. Late at night, when the foundation office was empty and the phones finally stopped ringing, I sometimes found myself wondering about Marcus and Isabella's. They had been innocent children when our parents destroyed our family, too young to understand the calculations behind my exile, too protected by their golden child status to recognize the cruelty of my abandonment. What had they been told about my disappearing? How had they processed the trial and its revelations about the parents they had trusted completely? I had deliberately avoided contact with my siblings during the legal proceedings, partly for strategic reasons, but mostly because I wasn't emotionally equipped to handle their potential rejection or judgment. The 12-year-old part of me that still remembered loving them was too fragile to risk discovering that they blamed me for destroying the family they had known, even if that family had been built on lies and exploitation. The first crack in my carefully constructed isolation came through an unexpected source: a private investigator named Rebecca Torres, who had been tracking white-collar crime patterns for a documentary filmmaker. Rebecca had discovered connections between my parents' case and a broader network of financial exploitation cases, involving elderly clients of Millbrook's most prestigious wealth management firm. "Your parents weren't operating alone," Rebecca explained during our initial meeting at the foundation office. "The trust manipulation and inheritance diversion tactics they used were too sophisticated for amateurs. Someone taught them these methods, and that someone has been using the same playbook with other families." The investigation that followed revealed a conspiracy that made my parents' crimes look like amateur hour. Thornton and Associates, the wealth management firm that had handled Elena's original estate planning, had been systematically identifying elderly clients with estranged family relationships and complex inheritance structure. They would then cultivate relationships with adult children who had financial pressures, teaching them how to exploit legal loopholes and institutional systems to access trust funds and inheritance money that should have been protected. My parents had been recruited into this scheme when Victor's dealerships first started struggling financially. Thornton and Associates had identified Elena's substantial estate and my parents' growing desperation as a perfect opportunity to test their manipulation tactics. The firm took a percentage of any successfully diverted funds while providing legal cover and institutional connections that made the theft appear legitimate. But the most shocking revelation was still to come. Elena had discovered the conspiracy before her death and had been working with federal investigators to expose the entire network. The box of documents she had kept in her closet wasn't just evidence of my parents' crimes. It was part of a larger investigation into systematic financial elder abuse that had victimized dozens of families across New England. Elena's death had halted the investigation just as it was reaching critical momentum. The federal agents who had been working with her, had assumed that her evidence had been lost when Victor and Marina gained control of her estate. They never knew that the crucial documentation had been preserved and would eventually reach me through Elena's carefully planned inheritance structure. Your grandmother was building a case that could have prevented hundreds of other families from being victimized, Rebecca explained, showing me FBI documents that had been partially declassified for her research. She died before she could complete her testimony, but the evidence she gathered is still legally valid. With your cooperation, we could restart the federal investigation and potentially expose a conspiracy that's been operating for over a decade. The request hit me like a physical blow. I had spent years fighting to move beyond my parents' betrayal, building a new life focused on helping other people rather than reliving my own trauma. The thought of voluntarily diving back into that darkness, of spending months or years investigating every detail of the conspiracy that had destroyed my childhood, felt like choosing to reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. But Elena's voice seemed to echo in my memory, reminding me of her stories about families she had helped reunite, children she had protected from abuse, the complex moral responsibility that came with having the power to help people who couldn't help themselves. How could I honor her memory by walking away from the opportunity to complete the work she had died trying to finish? The decision became even more complicated when Rebecca revealed the final piece of information that would change everything I thought I knew about my family's story. Marcus and Isabella had both been trying to contact me for years, but their attempts had been blocked by legal restrictions related to the criminal case and victim protection protocol. Your brother has been working with a private attorney to challenge your parents' narrative about what happened to you, Rebecca said, sliding a thick folder across the conference table. He started asking questions when he was old enough to understand that the family story about your behavioral problems didn't match his memories of who you actually were as a child. The folder contained letters Marcus had written but never been allowed to send, legal documents showing his attempts to locate me during my years at Riverside, and most shocking of all, evidence that he had been quietly investigating our parents' financial arrangements since he turned 18. He had discovered discrepancies in family financial records that led him to suspect Elena's inheritance had been misappropriated, but he hadn't known how to pursue the matter legally. Isabella's story was more complex but equally heartbreaking. She had suffered a severe emotional breakdown during her sophomore year of college when she finally understood that her perfect childhood had been built on my systematic exclusion and exploitation. She had spent 2 years in therapy processing the guilt of having been protected from a family dynamic that had destroyed her sister's childhood. Both of my siblings had been searching for ways to contact me that wouldn't violate the legal restrictions or re-traumatize me after everything I had endured. They had followed my advocacy work from a distance, proud of my accomplishments but uncertain whether I would want any contact with family members who represented such painful memories. Marcus wants to meet with you, Rebecca said gently. Not to ask for forgiveness or to rebuild a relationship you might not want, just to tell you what he remembered about losing you, and to offer whatever help he can provide if you decide to pursue the federal investigation. I stared at the folder containing years of my brother's attempts to find me, feeling something crack open in my chest that I had kept locked away since childhood. The professional advocate who had learned to maintain emotional distance from even the most heartbreaking cases was suddenly overwhelmed by the 12-year-old who had lost her entire family and never fully grieved that loss. For the first time since Elena's death, I faced the possibility that love and betrayal weren't mutually exclusive, that family could be both the source of deepest pain and unexpected healing. But accepting that possibility meant risking everything I had built to protect myself from further abandonment. The choice before me was more complex than any legal case I had ever handled: pursue justice for Elena and countless other victims, while potentially reconnecting with siblings I had spent years trying not to miss, or protect the careful emotional equilibrium I had achieved by maintaining my isolation from anything that reminded me of the family that had discarded me. Either way, the fortress I had built around my heart was about to be tested in ways I wasn't sure I was strong enough to handle. The meeting with Marcus took place on a cold February morning at a neutral location, a small cafe in Montpelier, halfway between Burlington and the Millbrook area where our childhood memories lived like ghosts. I arrived 30 minutes early, choosing a corner table where I could see the entrance and maintain some illusion of control over a situation that felt completely beyond my management. When Marcus walked through the door, I barely recognized the man he had become. The confident golden child I remembered had been replaced by someone who carried himself with the careful posture of a person who had learned that the world was more complicated and painful than he had been taught to expect. At 26, he was still handsome in the way that had always made adults light up when they saw him, but there was something different in his eyes, a gravity that spoke of losses that couldn't be fixed with charm or achievement. He spotted me immediately, and for a moment we simply stared at each other across the cafe, two adults meeting for the first time while carrying the weight of children who had been separated too young and under circumstances too cruel for either of us to have understood at the time. "Cassie," he said when he reached the table using the nickname I hadn't heard in over a decade. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I wasn't sure you." I gestured to the chair across from me, noting how he moved with the same careful precision that had characterized our father's business presentations. "Rebecca Torres said you had information about the federal investigation. I'm here in my professional capacity." It was a lie, and we both knew it. I was there because 16 years of wondering about my siblings had finally outweighed my fear of being hurt again, but professional distance felt safer than admitting how much I had missed him. Marcus nodded, accepting my boundaries while placing a thick folder on the table between us. "I've been investigating our parents' financial activities since I turned 18, and gained access to some family records. What I found," he paused, seeming to gather himself. "What I found made me understand that everything I thought I knew about our family was built on lies." The documents he showed me revealed a level of financial manipulation that went far beyond what had been exposed during the criminal trial. Marcus had discovered that our parents had been systematically defrauding elderly clients through Victor's car dealerships for years before they targeted Elena's inheritance. They would identify elderly customers with substantial assets, then use predatory lending practices to force them into financial dependency while slowly gaining control of their estates through legal manipulation. "Elena wasn't their first victim," Marcus explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She was just the one who fought back. They had already successfully stolen inheritance money from at least 6 other families before they started targeting her estate. But the most devastating revelation was personal rather than financial. Marcus had found correspondence between our parents and Thornton and Associates that discussed the Cassandra problem in clinical detail. They had viewed my emotional attachment to Elena not as a natural grandparent-grandchild bond, but as a threat to their financial schemes that needed to be eliminated through any means necessary. "They planned your exile from the beginning," Marcus said, his hands shaking slightly as he turned pages in the folder. "The behavioral problems, the boarding school story, all of it was manufactured to justify removing you from the equation. They knew Elena would fight for you if she could maintain contact, so they had to make sure she couldn't. The cruelest detail was a letter from Marina to her sister, written 2 months before my institutionalization, describing their relief at finding a permanent solution to the Cassandra situation that would allow them to focus on the children who matter while eliminating the ongoing financial drain of an ungrateful daughter." I sat in stunned silence, processing the confirmation that my worst suspicions had been accurate. My abandonment hadn't been a desperate last resort or a misguided attempt to help me. It had been a calculated business decision designed to facilitate the theft of my inheritance while removing any witness who might interfere with their plans. "Why are you showing me?" I asked when I could finally speak. "Why risk opening these wounds again?" Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense with something that looked like grief mixed with determination. "Because Isabella and I have been living with the guilt of benefiting from your suffering for years. Because we want to help you complete what Elena started. And because," he paused, swallowing hard, "because we want our sister back, if you'll have us." The simple honesty of his words hit me harder than any legal document or financial revelation. For the first time in our conversation, I saw past the careful adult presentation to the younger brother who had watched me disappear and spent years wondering what had happened to the sister he remembered loving. "I wasn't sure you would even remember me fondly," I admitted, my professional composure finally cracking. "You were the golden children. I was the problem that got solved." "You were our sister," Marcus said firmly. "The sister who helped me with homework when I was struggling in 3rd grade. The sister who let me hide in your room when Dad was angry about something. The sister who taught Isabella how to braid her hair and always shared your Halloween candy even when we forgot to share our." The memories he described felt like artifacts from someone else's life, fragments of connection and love that I had buried so deeply beneath layers of survival and professional achievement that I had almost forgotten they existed. But hearing him speak about the sister he remembered made me realize that my exile had wounded all of us in different ways. Isabella wants to see you too, Marcus continued. She's been terrified that you would blame her for being the daughter who got to stay, the one who got the opportunities that should have been yours. She's been in therapy for years trying to process the survivor guilt. Before I could respond, he pulled out his phone and showed me a text message from our sister. Tell Cassie I never forgot her birthday. Tell her I kept her stuffed elephant all these years because I hoped someday I could give it back to her. The mention of my childhood stuffed elephant, Miss Peanuts, a ridiculous gray creature with floppy ears that I had loved desperately, broke something open in me that I hadn't even realized I was holding closed. Isabella had kept a piece of my childhood safe for 16 years, preserving a connection I thought had been severed completely. The federal investigation isn't just about justice, Marcus said gently. It's about making sure no other family goes through what ours did, but it's also about the three of us finally having the chance to be siblings again if that's something you want. I looked across the table at this man who shared my DNA and my traumatic history, seeing both the privileged golden child who had been protected from the worst of our parents' cruelty and the adult who had chosen to confront difficult truths rather than maintain comfortable illusions. He was offering something I had convinced myself I no longer needed or wanted. The possibility of family connection that wasn't based on exploitation or convenience. What about our parents? I asked. They're getting out of prison in a few years. How do you feel about them being prosecuted again on federal charges? Marcus's expression hardened with a resolve I had never seen from him as a child. They destroyed our family for money. They threw away their daughter and traumatized their other children to steal from an elderly woman who loved us all. Whatever happens to them in federal court, they brought on themselves. The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours and covered territory I had never expected to navigate. Childhood memories that had been preserved by siblings who remembered them differently than I did. Adult perspectives on family trauma that none of us had been equipped to understand as children, and the complicated process of rebuilding trust between people who had been separated by circumstances beyond their control. When Marcus finally pulled out the official request from the FBI to cooperate with their reopened investigation, I realized that the decision had already been made. Somewhere deep in my heart, Alina's love had taught me to fight for vulnerable people, and the federal case would protect countless families from the conspiracy that had destroyed our. But more than that, pursuing justice alongside my siblings would allow us to honor our grandmother's memory together while reclaiming the family relationships that had been stolen from us along with everything else. I'll cooperate with the federal investigation, I told Marcus as we prepared to leave the cafe, and I'd like to see Isabella if she's ready for that. His smile was the first genuinely happy expression I had seen from him all day. She's been ready for 16 years, Cassie. We both. Walking out of that cafe, I felt something shift inside me that was both terrifying and liberating. The fortress I had built around my heart was coming down, brick by carefully constructed brick, making room for connections I had convinced myself were too dangerous to risk. For the first time since Alina's death, I wasn't facing the future alone. The federal investigation took 18 months to complete, and by the time it concluded, the conspiracy that had destroyed my childhood had been exposed as one of the largest elder abuse schemes in New England history. Thornton and Associates had systematically defrauded over 40 families, stealing more than $12 million in inheritance funds through the same tactics they had taught my parents to use against Alina. But the real story wasn't told in court documents or newspaper headlines. It was written in the quiet moments of rebuilding relationships that had been shattered by people who viewed love as weakness and family as a resource to be exploited. The reunion with Isabella happened 3 weeks after my meeting with Marcus in the same Burlington apartment where I had spent years convincing myself that isolation was safer than connection. When she knocked on my door carrying a worn gray elephant with floppy ears, we both broke down crying before either of us could speak. "I'm so sorry," she whispered as we held each other in my hallway, 16 years of guilt and grief pouring out in words that felt inadequate for the magnitude of what we had lost and found. "I should have fought for you. I should have asked more questions. I should have known something was wrong." "You were 10 years old," I reminded her, stroking her hair the way I used to when she had nightmares. You couldn't have known what they were planning, and you couldn't have stopped it even if you had. Isabella had grown into a beautiful woman who carried herself with the poise Marina had drilled into her from childhood, but underneath the perfect exterior was someone who had spent years questioning everything she had been taught about family, success, and the price of privilege. She worked as a victim advocate for domestic violence survivors, having chosen a career that let her help people who had been betrayed by those who claimed to love them. "I chose this work because of you," she admitted during one of our long conversations about the years we had lost. "Every woman I help escape an abusive situation, every child I place in protective custody, I think about how no one protected you when you needed it most." Marcus had made similar choices, becoming a financial crimes investigator who specialized in inheritance fraud and elder abuse cases. Both of my siblings had built careers around preventing other families from experiencing the devastation that had torn ours apart, transforming their guilt into purpose in ways that honored both Alina's memory and the sister they had been forced to lose. The three of us working together on the federal case created a bond that was both entirely new and surprisingly familiar. We had different strengths. My legal expertise, Marcus's financial investigation skills, Isabella's understanding of family trauma, but when we combined our knowledge, we became a formidable team that the FBI agents described as the most effective civilian cooperation they had ever experienced. Victor and Marina's second trial was even more devastating than their first conviction had been. The federal prosecutors had evidence of systematic conspiracy, racketeering, and wire fraud that extended their criminal liability far beyond what they had faced in state court. More importantly, they now faced their 3 adult children testifying against them not out of revenge, but out of a shared commitment to protecting other families from similar exploitation. When I took the witness stand for the federal case, I wasn't the isolated young woman seeking personal justice that I had been during the state trial. I was part of a family that had been broken by our parents' choices but had chosen to rebuild itself around shared values of protection, accountability, and genuine love rather than conditional approval. The defendants taught us that family loyalty meant accepting abuse and exploitation without question. I testified during the most crucial moment of the trial, but we learned from our grandmother Elena that real family loyalty means protecting each other from harm, even when that harm comes from people who share our DNA. Victor and Marina were sentenced to additional federal prison terms that would keep them incarcerated until they were well into their 70s, but more importantly, the testimony and evidence we provided led to the conviction of 6 other conspirators and the recovery of stolen assets for dozens of victimized families. The legal victory was satisfying, but the personal healing was transformative in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time since Elena's death, I had people in my life who knew my whole story and loved me not, despite my trauma, but because of the strength I had developed in surviving it. Marcus and Isabella didn't try to pretend that we could simply pick up where we had left off as children. Too much had happened, too much time had passed, and we were fundamentally different people than we would have been if our family had remained intact. Instead, we built something new, adult relationships based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the conscious choice to prioritize each other's well-being. Our parents made several attempts to contact us during their imprisonment, sending letters that alternated between manipulation, "We only did what we thought was best for the family," and threats, "You'll regret destroying your own parent." We responded as a united front, making it clear that any relationship would require genuine accountability for their actions and evidence of fundamental change in their character. None of us expected such accountability to ever materialize. People who could abandon their own child and steal from an elderly woman were not people capable of the kind of honest self-reflection that real redemption required. But we left the door open, not because we owed them anything, but because we had learned from Elena that love sometimes meant hoping for impossible transformations while protecting yourself from further harm. The Elena Vale Foundation became a family project, with Marcus handling financial investigations and Isabella providing trauma-informed care for young survivors. Together, we expanded the foundation's scope to include educational programs about inheritance protection, advocacy for institutional care reform, and emergency assistance for young people aging out of systems that had failed to protect them. But the most meaningful moment came on the 5th anniversary of Elena's death, when we gathered at her gravesite to tell her about the work being done in her name and the family she had fought to protect. Isabella brought flowers from Elena's favorite garden. Marcus brought a photo of all 3 of us together for the first time since childhood.
I brought a letter describing how her love had not just saved me financially, but had taught me that family was something you built through daily choices, rather than something you inherited through biology. I think she would be proud of who we became, Isabella said, as we stood together in the quiet cemetery, three adults who had found their way back to each other, despite every obstacle their parents had created. She would be proud that we found each other again, Marcus added, that we chose love over bitterness, justice over revenge, family over isolation. I nodded, feeling Elena's presence in the wind that rustled through the trees she had loved. She would be proud that we learned the difference between the family that failed us and the family we chose to become. Walking away from that cemetery together, I realized that the scared 12-year-old who had been abandoned by her parents was finally, truly gone. In her place stood someone who understood that real strength came not from perfect invulnerability, but from the courage to love deeply despite the risk of loss. The inheritance Elena had left me wasn't just money, it was the knowledge that some people will betray every trust placed in them, while others will sacrifice everything to protect the people they love. More importantly, it was the understanding that we always have the choice about which kind of person we become. My parents had chosen exploitation over love, control over connection, personal gain over family loyalty, but Marcus, Isabella, and I had chosen differently. We had chosen to honor Elena's memory by building the kind of family she had always hoped we could become, not perfect, not without scars, but strong enough to protect each other, and generous enough to extend that protection to others who needed it. That night, sharing dinner in my apartment with my siblings for the first time in 16 years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Elena's death, the deep peace that comes from being known, loved, and accepted exactly as you are. The fortress I had built around my heart had been replaced by something better, a home built from trust, watered with honesty, and strong enough to weather whatever storms the future might bring. Sometimes the best inheritance isn't money or property, it's the knowledge that you're worthy of love, and the strength to build family connections that honor the best of what love can be. Elena had given me both, and I had finally learned how to accept the gift. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.